This is how to rebuild a linear transducer, more specifically the TE Celesco model, as shown on the screen. Let's get started. So this video is sped up, and you could decrease the playback speed by using the YouTube playback speed setting. It's a little gear on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. You can slow it down, speed it up, do whatever you'd like. The steps of the rebuild process are going to be displayed on the left-hand side of the screen. And if you need to, pause the video at any point if you need a little bit more time. Okay, step one, first thing we're going to do is clean the exterior. These things get pretty nasty and it makes the rebuild process a lot more enjoyable if you clean them off. All right, step two, we're going to remove the rear cover. So the first thing we're going to do is take those little black caps off. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they aren't. And usually underneath there's a little bit of silicone. You dig that out and you can access those cap screws. The other two screws you're not going to need to take out. So we're just going to focus on these two first. Once we get those two screws out, we'll be able to separate the transducer board housing from the rest of the actual transducer. But when you do, be careful. There is some wiring on the inside for the potentiometer. Don't want to yank it apart and break those wires. As you can see, next thing we're going to do is disconnect the potentiometer from the transducer board. Pretty simple, just be careful, be gentle with it. Step 4, removing the potentiometer. First thing we're going to do is peel off that sticker. That'll expose the two set screws. Next thing we're going to do is remove the two Phillips head screws for the potentiometer plate. Once we get those two screws out, set them off to the side. You can see we can't separate it yet until we remove the two set screws. To get to those set screws, you got to pull the cable out a little bit. And we're using a 50 thousandths Allen wrench, flat end Allen wrench, not ball end. Can't tell you, some of these set screws are in there very, very tight from the manufacturer, and it will snap the ball end clean off of the Allen wrench, and that part is essentially junk. So make sure you use a flat face 50 thousandths Allen wrench to loosen those set screws. You can see here I'm struggling with these ones even. So yeah, make sure you don't use a ball end or it'll snap off in the end. Once you get those two set screws loose, that'll allow you to pull out the potentiometer. Once you get the potentiometer out, you can set it off to the side. Next step, we're going to obviously remove the potentiometer and the cover. Inside of the cover, you'll see a little metal shim there. Don't try to pull the spool out. Don't try to do anything with that yet. We'll move on to the next step. All right, these next steps involve the clock spring. The clock spring has a good amount of energy that can be released. If you're not careful, it can fire out and cause bodily harm, so make sure you're wearing safety glasses. If you feel like wearing gloves, you can wear gloves. The big thing is just don't just start yanking stuff apart because it could potentially fire out. Step 5, removing the spring housing. So again, make sure you're holding everything nice and tight together as you see me doing here. You're going to take out the two cap screws from the spring housing cover. Always holding tightly. And once you get those screws completely out, you're going to take the two halves, sandwich them together, and just let it spin in your hands until that spring stops rotating. And you're going to carefully pull the spring housing and spring apart from the spool fork that I'm pointing at there. Take note of that plastic shim. The plastic shim goes between the spring and the actual housing for the spool to prevent it from getting damaged because it is just soft aluminum. Step 6, removing the cable. So basically what we're going to do now is pull the spool out, unravel everything, and on the inside of that spool there's a little brass or copper compression sleeve. Just cut that and the cable will come right out. Step 6, part 2. I'm going to slide that rubber bushing back, and basically what we're doing is just cutting the old cable off. I'm going to take that steel eyelet and that rubber bushing and save it for later. Step 7, cleaning the spool housing. This is probably the most important step. If that's not cleaned out, all that debris you see build up in there, it's just going to destroy the new cable. It's very abrasive, so make sure you use a combination of a pick, compressed air, soap and water, whatever you have to do to get all of that debris out of there. Make sure it's clean and dry and ready for the new cable. So it's time to build a new cable. We're going to grab our compression tool, our copper compression sleeve, and our spool of new cable, all of which were purchased from McMaster-Carr. I'll leave those part numbers in the description below. We're going to insert the cable through the rubber bushing. That's the first step. Next one, copper sleeve. Then we're going to loop that cable back around, go back through the copper sleeve, and we're just going to stick it out about a 1/16 of an inch past the copper sleeve, just like that. Then we're going to take the steel eyelet and just kind of slide it up until it's snug on there. It doesn't need to be super tight, it just needs to not come off. Then we're going to take our compression tool and we're going to compress it 3 times the length. So 1, 2, 3 different times down the length of that compression sleeve in the same direction, same orientation, right? Then we're going to rotate that compression sleeve 90 degrees and do the same thing again. And what we're trying to create is like a little plus sign. So one thing to note is we don't want to over compress this, because if you squish the daylights out of it, that rubber bushing that we need will no longer fit over top of that copper sleeve, or at least it's going to be very difficult to put back on. So make sure you don't squeeze it too hard and over extrude that copper. It is just a soft metal. You want to compress it just enough. Once you get everything compressed, give it a pull test, make sure it's not going to come apart. Check it out. As you can see, it looks like a little plus sign. Nice even. Give it a tug. Don't pull too hard, but just enough to make sure it's not going to come apart. And then put the rubber bushing back over top of the copper sleeve. Step 8, part 3, making sure the cable is the right length. It's 53 inches from the center of the steel eyelet to the end of the cable. I like to tape it down, make sure I measure it correctly. From the center of the eyelet to the end of the cable is 53 inches. So measure twice, cut once. Once you do that, it's time to move on to step 9, installing a new cable. So first thing we're going to do is install the cable through the housing. If you notice any kind of debris or buildup on the end of the cable, stop what you're doing, clean the housing. It's probably still got some buildup in there. Making sure it's clean goes a long way in preventing the cable from failing prematurely. Next, we're going to route the cable in through the actual spool itself. You'll notice that the spool hole is drilled at an angle, so they do that on purpose to make the cable lay flat and not put so much stress on the cable itself. So I just want you to take note of that. Once you get the cable through the spool, you're going to install another copper sleeve onto the end of that cable. You want about an 1/8 inch or so of the cable sticking past the sleeve. And again, you're going to compress 3 times down the length of the sleeve. Use a fair bit more force when doing this one. We don't have to worry about a rubber bushing, so I like to make sure we grip it nice and tight. And what you'll notice is even after the first pass that cable is still sliding around inside of the sleeve. That's fine. It's normal. Just make sure that cable is still sticking out about an 1/8 inch before you start your next pass. So rotate it 90 degrees, just like the other one. crimp it 3 times. 1, 2, 3, creating that plus sign that we talked about earlier. The good amount of force. And that's about what it should look like there. We're going to take it, grab it, give it a tug, and we're going to pull that cable back through that the hole in the spool until that sleeve is resting on the inside face of that spool. Step 10, reinstalling the spool and setting spring tension. So you're going to start by pulling the cable all the way out. Once the spool is in there, pull it all the way out, and we're going to reel it back in. And while we're reeling it back in, we're going to put a little bit of drag on the cable to make sure that the cable lays flat on the spool. The next thing you'll notice is there's a little hook on the end of that spring. You want to make sure that that hook engages on the little fork that's on the spool itself. Don't forget the plastic shim between the spring and the spool housing. So that fork goes onto that hook for the spring, and then we're going to rotate the spring 13 quarter turns clockwise. And you'll know you did it right when those holes line up with the housing. So we install the cap screws. Make sure you keep a firm grip on the spring housing because it does have energy in it now. Don't want it spinning off on you. Once you get those screws installed, you can kind of relax your grip a little bit. What I like to do is pull the cable all the way out gently until it stops, and then gently and safely bring it back in, because what tends to happen is somebody will accidentally let it go and it snaps back, and it could really damage the cable and it could hurt your finger. So extend it out fully and let it go all the way back, and what that does is it resets that cable and lets it sit nice and flat on the spool. 11. Final reassembly. We're finally ready to go back together with this thing, and the first thing that we're going to do is install the potentiometer. We want to make sure that that potentiometer is lined up with its alignment pin here. There's a little plastic fork that sits over top of this alignment pin to prevent the potentiometer from rotating inside of the housing. The next thing we're going to do is take this little metal shim here and place it on top of that spool. And once we go back together, we want to make sure that that alignment pin for the potentiometer and this cable are sharing the same corner. So before you put those Phillips head screws in, make sure that that is correct. And you can start tightening everything up. Once you get those screws nice and snug, we're going to move over to the set screws on the spool. So again, pull that cable out until you can get access to those set screws. We're just snugging those up. They don't need to be super tight. And again, don't use a ball end, because you could potentially snap the ball end off inside of the set screw. Remember, there are 2 set screws. You got to get both of those snugged up. Next, we're going to take and reconnect the potentiometer to the transducer board. So once we get that connected, we will just kind of orient it to where the wiring isn't going to get pinched. Sometimes you got to spin it around. The ultimate goal is just to make sure that that wire isn't going to get pinched and everything sits nice and flush. So one thing to point out here is our setup. We have the communications connector and the cable 180 out from each other. So before you put the cap screws back on and complete the reassembly, make sure that that orientation is correct. That connector end and this cable end need to be 180 degrees out from each other. Then we can start reinstalling the cap screws. Again, making sure everything is sitting flush before you really start tightening everything down. Pull the cable out, make sure everything is good, nothing's binding. Next thing I use is a little bit of clear sealant. It's what the OEM does, so I try to copy it. Install those plastic plugs. I've got these 3D printed plugs that I made to put over top of the spool cover. If you don't have that, clean the surface and put a little piece of electrical tape on there. That should be more than sufficient. But that's pretty much it. Hopefully this video helped you out and you were successful in your rebuild. Thanks for watching.